Yes, my family was incarcerated for 6.5 years in various concentration and detention camps. And for the last 1.5 years, we were in Bergen-Belsen. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us, threatening us with their rifles, and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old, and to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evening, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in the section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other, and this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks, meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress, and this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother, and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine 2 adults, 2 strangers, sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions? A bunk that was no larger than the small cot bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies, thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy. There was no toilet paper. There was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost 1.5 years that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slush through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, pat of butter, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peel. Bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. And we had heard about extermination camps and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you're all very aware of stories and films pertaining to the Holocaust, but the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror, and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there was a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games, and one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find 4 pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the 4 members of my family would all survive: my mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find that 3rd or 4th pebble? Might that mean that 1 or 2 of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked. Using an empty can as a pot and pieces from the wooden slats from our bunk as firewood, my mother somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. In our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure that if I had cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they were going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities, no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive. And who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious disease that's caused from filth, and it's spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. And in addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burnt leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train, demanding civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over the homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here, 35 pounds, and my mother weighed a mere 60 pounds. The Russians, in their crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication, and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also relearned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. Weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation, and this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother Albert actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I am relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. This is my mother on her 104th birthday. Mom passed away just about 1.5 years ago, 6 weeks short of 105. Amazing lady. When I lecture in schools, I always tell the students that we always saw my mom because she only lived about 20 minutes from us. And when we would travel, and we do a lot of that, speaking in schools, we would speak to my mom several times a day, and I tell them that they too need to check in with their moms and their dads, always tell them where they're going, and make sure they tell them when they'll be back. Very important message. This is the very star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us and to isolate us and to set us apart from the rest of society. This, of course, is the Star of David, our Magen David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol, but the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us, must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such horror from ever happening again. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, color of our skin, or national origin. And this respect towards one another must begin in our homes. We must treat people as individuals, look for similarities, and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out to one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. As I tell the students, it is not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. Important messages for all of us to remember. In addition to our 6 million Jewish men and women who perished during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. There were also 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. And among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them. Very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. As we know, they hid them in attics, they hid them in basements, farmers would hide them out in the barns, and they were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they were also deported to concentration camps, and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and definitely apply to today's world situation and our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. I'd like to share, I still have time, about my brother. My brother is 2 years older than I am, happily married, but by choice will not bring children into this world. Has a very difficult time with organized religion. He deals with this situation altogether differently than I do. His choices of not having children and having a difficult time with even our religion makes me very sad. But I do not fault Albert. We have to remember my brother is 2 years older than I am. I was with my father in the men's section, and I know that he experienced and saw things that I did not. So as sad as this is, I do not fault him. God puts us on this earth, gives us a mind, a beautiful mind, which allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. It allows us to make choices. Therefore, men did this to one another. We have very little control as to what goes on in this world. We just need to be good and kind towards one another, which is such a simple message. And we just have to remember to respect one another. And that is the basis for peace, 100%. I wish you, and I wish all your listening audience and your audio audience, your children, grandchildren, and all succeeding generations, a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace.